It's July 2023 and I'm currently sailing down the River Avon near the small market town of Stratford, a town famous for its former MP John Profumo and some unheard of author called Billy Shakespeare. Being at one of the most convenient locations to cross the River Avon, the area of modern-day Stratford has been settled since at least Roman era, with remains of a Roman town having been found close to the modern centre of Stratford. It's believed that an Anglo-Saxon monastery existed at the site of what is today Holy Trinity Church, though if it was there it would have been destroyed by Viking invaders in 1015. Stratford remained a village until the late 12th century, when it was developed into a town by the then Lord of the Manor, with a new town being laid out on a grid system about a half-mile north of the site of the monastery. Still to today, the area around Holy Trinity Church is referred to as Old Town. At the same time, in 1196, Richard I granted a charter to the town which allowed it to hold a weekly market. As such, Stratford dates its full transition to market town to this time, celebrating their 800th anniversary in 1996. The development of the town led to the area becoming a place of work for tradesmen and merchants. By 1252, the town had approximately 240 houses along with shops and other buildings. The tradesmen established a guild, known as the Guild of the Holy Cross. The guild developed into the town's main local government, building a chapel, guild hall, almshouses and a school. The guild was abolished in 1547 under Edward VI's suppression of guilds, so the inhabitants of Stratford petitioned the Crown for a charter of incorporation as a borough, which they received in 1553. This allowed the formation of a new town council, which could take on the property and responsibility of the guild. The charter refounded the school as King Edward VI School. The Cotswolds were a major sheep-producing area, with Stratford one of the main centres for processing and distribution of wool and sheep, and it also became a centre for tanning in the 15th century, with glove-making an important side industry, making use of the tanned hide. And with that, from stage right, the first protagonists in our little play can enter. Richard Shakespeare was a tenant farmer in the village of Snitterfield, renting his land from local landowner Robert Arden. Richard had two sons, Henry and John. With Henry being the older, he took on his dad's profession of farming, whilst John trained to become a glover, undertaking a lengthy apprenticeship to become qualified. The two sons would have been taken on regular occasions to Robert Arden's farm to pay the quarterly rent by Richard, and it's here they would have met Robert's youngest, and by all accounts favourite child, Mary Arden. With John established as a professional tradesman, a businessman and an alderman running his gloving business, and Mary the well-heeled member of a landed gentry, it wasn't an unsurprising match for the two of them to wed sometime around 1557. The family settled in John's combined workshop and house in the centre of Stratford. Sadly, Mary's first two children both died very young, but the third child, a son, would go on to just be a little bit special. Baptised on the 26th of April 1564, but likely born 3 days early on the 23rd, William Shakespeare was the oldest of the surviving children, with Mary giving birth to another 5 children, 4 of whom survived childhood. John, whilst a skilled glove maker, was not, by records from the time, the greatest of businessmen, regularly making decisions that had a negative impact on the family's finances. But that didn't prevent him being able to send William to the town school, and whilst there was no national curriculum and grammar schools did vary in quality, it's likely that a young William would have been taught an intensive education, particularly in grammar and language, based on classical Latin authors. The key takeaway from that is, despite the multiple conspiracy theories, the fact the educated first son of a businessman and landowner's daughter turned out to be a literary genius who produced a canon of work that more than 400 years later is still underpinning education across the English-speaking world isn't completely unexpected. What Shakespeare wasn't was an uneducated country bumpkin. The house where Shakespeare was born dates back to the mid-16th century, or possibly as early as the 15th century. All that is documented is that in 1552, John Shakespeare was fined for leaving a pile of muck outside the house, showing that he was already resident there 5 years before his marriage to Mary Arden, and possibly living a bit of a bachelor's lifestyle. On John's death in 1601, the house passed to William, but by then he was already wildly successful and had bought new place, so he had no need for the house. The main house was leased to Lewis Hickox, who converted it into an inn and a small one-bay house. At the time of Shakespeare's death, the house was occupied by his recently widowed sister, Joan Hart. In William's will, the house passed to his eldest daughter, Susanna, and she passed it on to her only child, Elizabeth, and then in 1670 to Thomas Hart, descendant of Joan. The house remained in the Hart family until 1806, when it was sold to butcher Thomas Court, who took over running the inn. William had 3 children, Susanna and the twins Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet died aged 11. Judith did have 3 sons, but none of them had children. Susanna had 1 daughter, Elizabeth, who also had no children. So, by 1670, all descendants of William Shakespeare had passed, and with no further interest, the house started to fall into a state of disrepair until the 18th century, when a rekindling of interest in the bard sparked a tourism trail to Stratford that hasn't let up. Early tourists include Charles Dickens, Sir Walter Scott, Lord Byron, John Keats and William Thackeray, but as so often it took the potential of losing everything to encourage preservation. In 1846, Court's widow passed away and the whole building was put up for sale. American showman P.T. Barnum proposed to buy up the house and ship it brick by brick to the US. In response, the Shakespeare Birthday Committee was established by a private Act of Parliament and with the help of donors, including Dickens, raised the necessary £3,000 and bought it. The Shakespeare Birthday Committee still exists. Today it's called the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and along with Shakespeare's birthplace, it also owns the site of New Place, more on that later, Hall's Croft, the house that Susanna lived in, Mary Arden's farm, and a mile away, the cottage where Anne Hathaway grew up and lived while she was being courted by William. A young William would often walk for a mile or so from his dad's house and workshop to Anne's cottage in the village of Shottery. The earliest part of the cottage dates to 1463, and in Shakespeare's day it would have been known as Hewlands Farm. John Hathaway, Anne's grandfather, first moved there in 1542. In 1581, on the death of Richard Hathaway, Anne's father, the cottage passed to Anne's brother Bartholomew, whilst Anne was left with a sum of 10 marks, or £6, 13 shillings and 4 pence, around £4,500 in 2023, to be paid at the day of her marriage. A 26-year-old Anne wed the 18-year-old William in November 1582. 6 months later, Susanna was born. So that's a toy boy, premarital sex, shotgun wedding and an inheritance. There are no plot lines that Shakespeare isn't responsible for. With their marriage, Anne moved out of the cottage and initially moved in with Shakespeare's parents in the centre of Stratford, living with them for a number of years whilst William built his fame and fortune in London, returning to Stratford and purchasing New Place in 1597. Bartholomew began expansion work on the cottage in 1610 and continued expanding and extending the property until his death in 1624. The cottage passed down the Hathaway family until 1846, when financial problems, which had been plaguing the family for nearly 150 years, finally forced them to sell it. However, they were permitted to remain in the cottage as tenants. Thankfully, 1846 is a rather convenient year, as that's the year the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust had been founded to save Shakespeare's birthplace, and so when the opportunity to purchase the property came up in 1892, the Trust acquired Hewlands Farm, allowing William Baker and his mother Mary to remain living there until Mary's death in 1911. Back in Stratford and back from London with his fortune and fame, William set about buying the second grandest house in town, New Place. The house was completed in 1483 and passed through various hands until in 1567 it was purchased by William Underhill I, a lawyer and major property holder in Warwickshire. After his death in 1570, New Place passed to his son, William Underhill II, who sold the property to William Shakespeare in 1597 for £60, about £11,500 in current money. However, the deal ended up in the kind of legal mess that makes a complicated chain and interest rate rises look like a walk in the park. Just 2 months after he sold the property to Shakespeare and before the contracts had been completed, Underhill died poisoned at the hand of his son and heir, Fulk. There's dispute about what happened to Fulk. He may have died before it was discovered he'd murdered his exceptionally wealthy father, or it's possible that he was hung for murder in 1599. Whatever happened, as the heir had murdered his dad, the whole inheritance, including New Place, was forfeited to the Crown. In 1602, the Court of Exchequer appointed a commission to obtain an account of the possessions of Fulk Underhill. Thankfully for Shakespeare, Fulk's younger brother Hercules also came of age in 1602. How convenient a plot device, and his father's properties were regranted to him, and shortly afterwards Hercules and Shakespeare negotiated a confirmed sale. Every single possible plotline. William lived in New Place up until his death on the 23rd of April 1616. The coincidence of dying on his 52nd birthday does suggest that he had a rather successful birthday party. Keeping things in the family, the house next door was owned by Thomas Nash, who went on to marry Elizabeth Hall, William's granddaughter. On Nash's death, he attempted to leave New Place in his will to his cousin Edward Nash, claiming that he owned the property and that Elizabeth's mum, Suzanne Hall, was my mother-in-law who lives with me. Some legal wrangling later, and Susanna successfully retained the house that her dad had purchased. Every single possible plotline, even from beyond the grave. The Nash house is still standing, but what about New Place? By 1756, the then owner was a cantankerous and not particularly loving man of God, the Reverend Francis Gastrell. Tired of visitors paying tribute to the bard by hopping over the fence to look at a mulberry tree in the garden that William had planted, he destroyed the tree. That didn't go down well with the townsfolk, who in retaliation destroyed the windows of New Place. Gastrell applied for permission to extend the garden, but the local council decided to reject his application and increase his taxes instead, likely in further retaliation for the mulberry tree. Gastrell argued that he shouldn't have to pay tax as he didn't get to enjoy the house because of all the visitors, but then decided he could avoid paying altogether if there simply wasn't a building to tax. So in 1759, he demolished the house. The ensuing outrage by the population of Stratford forced Gastrell to flee. In 1876, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust acquired both Nash House and the empty plot where New Place had been. Today, the Nash House houses an exhibition on Shakespeare's life, as well as a copy of the first folio of Shakespeare's work, published by a group of his friends in 1623 to preserve his work for posterity. During his life, William had been a lay rector at Holy Trinity Church, and it's for that reason only that 2 days after his death, William was laid to rest in the chancel of the church rather than the graveyard. It was tradition at that time that a grave was only rented for a number of years before the bones were removed and burnt on a bone fire, making the grave available for resale to another family. Reflecting the fear of either ending up on a bone fire or being removed from the church, the grave is unique in having a curse engraved on a tomb inside a church. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. Shakespeare's legacy, both to the English language and the town of Stratford-upon-Avon, can't be disputed. Certainly no other market town can boast such a major theatre that attracts some of the world's most famous actors to perform in than Stratford. From the tower of the RSC Theatre, you can look across the whole of Stratford, picking out those parts of the town that would have been familiar to William, as well as those that have arrived since the bard's time. Time doesn't stand still, and Stratford spent several more centuries being an important industrial town before drifting in the 20th century into the tourist hotspot that it is today. The Cotswolds continued to be an important sheep country, and Stratford continued to be at the heart of that trade. In 1793, an Act was passed for the construction of a canal to allow coal traffic from Dudley and Stourbridge to reach Oxford and London without having to go through Birmingham. The canal consisted of two sections, from Kings Norton, where it joins the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, to the junction of the Grand Union Canal at Kingswood, and a southern section from Kingswood to Bancroft Basin in Stratford, where it joins the Avon. Construction took 23 years, with the completed canal finally opening in 1816, but the canal was never particularly successful, and following acquisition by a railway company just 40 years later, it declined. By 1945, the southern section was totally unnavigable, and the northern section little better. The only reason water was still running in the southern section of the canal was to supply the GWR engine shed at Stratford Station. The sorry state of the canal and the machinations of GWR to make their life easier by replacing a broken lifting bridge with a fixed bridge, effectively cutting the canal in 1947, brought attention to the decline of the entire canal network in the UK. After the issue was raised in the House of Lords in 1947, GWR assured that the bridge would be lifted at any time on notice of intended passage being given. Tom Rolt of the Inland Waterways Association announced he intended to pass under the bridge on the 20th of May 1947, and, despite some difficulties, including the accompanying boat provided by the GWR getting stuck, the bridge was reached where it had been jacked up on heavy timbers. The state of Canal and forcing GWR and after nationalisation British Railways to lift the bridge came a bit of a cause célèbre, fuelled further when Warwickshire County Council tried to obtain legal abandonment of the canal in 1958 so they could replace another bridge without leaving any headroom. Two canoeists who had recently used the canal produced their dated toll tickets showing the canal was, despite all looks to the contrary, not disused. On the 22nd of May 1959, retention of the canal was announced, and with it the tide started to turn on the UK canal network. A few months later, the British Transport Commission and National Trust reported they'd agreed the terms of the lease, under which the National Trust took responsibility for the restoration and maintenance of the southern section. The project to restore the canal was managed by David Hutchins, who pioneered the use of voluntary labour, which would go on to be used extensively on subsequent canal restorations. By mid-1964, the canal was fully navigable. And just 10 years later, restoration work on the Upper Avon meant the whole route through Stratford to the Severn had been reopened. Today, with leisure craft using both the canal and the lock down into the Avon, it carries more traffic than it did at the height of its commercial use. Several companies offer tours of the Avon, either starting in Bancroft Basin or on the banks of the river itself, taking the same route downstream to the weir and then back, passing the rear of Holy Trinity Church for one of the best views of Shakespeare's final resting place. And then on past the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. With some tours passing further up the Avon to almost the end of the river's navigability. Stratford-upon-Avon railway station has a half-hourly service from West Midlands trains to Birmingham Moor Street, Birmingham Snow Hill and Kidderminster, with some trains extending on to Worcester. Journey time to Birmingham is around 50 minutes. Prior to COVID, Chiltern Railways used to provide direct trains to London Marylebone, but these are currently cut back to a train every other hour to Leamington Spa, where you can change for Chiltern trains to London and cross-country services to Bournemouth, Reading, Oxford, Coventry, Birmingham International, Birmingham New Street and Manchester.